Hello and welcome to this recorded presentation aimed at supporting delivery staff in preparing their learners for the theory exam component of the technical qualification. My name is Alison Whittle and I'm the Post 16 Technical Advisor at City and Guilds. During this presentation we will be looking at the resources that are available to you, looking at how to understand the exam guidance in the qualification handbook and the exam guides, understanding the use of command verbs in exam questions, some of the question types, looking at the integrated questions where the big marks are, exam hints and tips, and finally a summary. We have a number of resources on the website that are available to you to download. The Teaching, Learning and Assessment Guide, shown on the infographic on the far left-hand side, provides important information for delivery staff. I have included a link to this document here on the presentation. Every technical qualification has a sector-specific exam guide containing information relating to the qualification that you're delivering. There are sample papers and mark schemes for all of our technical qualifications, and at least 2 past papers and mark schemes for every qualification. This is to help teachers with the structure of the exams. These can be used as mock or practice papers, or even as a guide to help you produce your own formative assessments. There is a qualification report for every technical qualification, and that's produced by the principal examiner, and it provides valuable information that relates to how the assessments have performed for that year. It will contain all the information you need and the grade boundaries for both the 2 theory exams and the synoptic assignments for that academic year, and the achievement rates for the qualification as a whole. This slide looks at understanding the theory exam guidance in each of the qualification handbooks. This is an example taken from the Hair and Beauty Studies Technical Award 3038-21. You can see from the screenshot that it focuses on the theory exam component. So there are 60 marks in total for the theory exam, and these marks are aggregated into a percentage to equal 100%. You can see from this screenshot that the majority of the marks for the theory exam are focused from Unit 202. You can see that there are 35 marks taken from that unit for the theory exam, which aggregates to 59% of the overall exam. You can see that there are 8 marks taken from Unit 201, which aggregates to 13% of the overall exam. And you can see that there are 5 marks from Unit 203, which is the practical component of the exam. The same marks and percentage weighting remain the same each year. Although the questions will change, you know that the majority of that questions for this particular exam will come from Unit 202, and the same information is available in every single qualification handbook. So this slide shows another example. This is taken from the City and Guilds Level 2 Technical Certificate in Bricklaying. You can see from the screenshot on the far left hand side that there are 5 units or modules in the qualification. However, you can see that the theory exam, which is shown in the infographic on the far right hand side, is focused on only 2 of those units or modules, which are Unit 201 and 202. So the same principles apply. The majority of marks are taken from Unit 202, with 30 marks in total aggregating to 50% of the theory exam, and a further 18 marks, which aggregates to 30% of the theory exam, are taken from Unit 201. The remaining 12 marks, or 20% of the theory exam, are taken from the integration questions from Assessment Objective 4, which covers all units assessed by the exam. So following on from the previous slide where I mentioned Assessment Objective 4, and just to provide a more detailed explanation of that, the exams, or the theory exams, are based on the following set of assessment objectives, AOs. and they're designed to allow the candidates' responses to be assessed across the following 3 categories of performance. And this is AO1, which is recall, and that recalls knowledge from across the breadth of the qualification. AO2, understanding, which allows candidates to demonstrate understanding of concepts, theories and processes. And AO4, which, as I said, is approximately 20% of the theory exam, is about integration of knowledge, which allows the learner to apply the knowledge, understanding and skills from the breadth of the qualification in an holistic way. Now, the Qualification Handbook and Exam Guide will state the broad weighting of each question type in a particular question paper. It's an important aspect of the technicals exams that learners are assessed across all of these 3 assessment objectives in an appropriate way, so they can demonstrate that not only can they recall knowledge they've been taught, but they can also demonstrate the depth of understanding they have on particular topics or syllabus areas. So to clarify, each exam assesses a sample of the content of these units, and this means that a single exam will not cover 100% of the unit content. The full range of content will be assessed over a number of examination series, and details of the coverage of a particular exam paper will not be released in advance of the exam itself. So centres shouldn't make assumptions about what will be assessed by a particular exam based on what has been covered on previous occasions. So in order to be fully prepared for the exam, learners must be ready to answer questions on any of the content in the units that we've outlined that are taken from the theory exam. As I mentioned in slide 3, there is a qualification specific guide to each of the examinations. You can see how the marks relate to the units we discussed in slide 6. Now this shows how the 30 marks available in Unit 202 have been distributed across Unit 202's learning outcomes. And it very clearly focuses on the knowledge outcomes of Learning Outcome 1 and Learning Outcome 3. Now this level of detail, which is available in every single qualification handbook and exam guide, will help you when planning your delivery and preparing your learners for their theory exam. Every qualification has this information in the handbook, in the qualification handbook, and in the guide to the examination document. Now that we have detailed where the information can be found to help you in delivering the theory exam, we will now going to focus on some question types, starting with hints and tips on preparing for the exam. So the first thing is make sure you can access the exam guide for your technical qualification. It's a really helpful thing to use a tutorial session with your learners and to take them through the exam guide for the qualification units, learning outcomes and the topics and the number of marks assigned for each unit, as we explained on slides 3 and 4. It's really also helpful to be clear with your learners that when these units are being taught and when there are any follow-up revision sessions planned to help them prepare for their theory exam. Make sure your learners have understood the exam question types and the related command verbs that they're going to come across during the theory papers or the online tests. Please make sure everybody knows when the exam is scheduled to take place, and also plan for mock exams or mock assessments to take place in the autumn and the spring terms. You can use the exemplar exam papers that we provide, or you can even take and design your own using some of the questions from the papers available on the website. So moving on to understanding of command verbs in questions. To pick out the main points on this slide, it's important learners are able to recognise and respond to command verbs, as this tells them the type of response the examiner is looking for. So I've emboldened the different types of command verbs typically used to test knowledge, understanding and applied learning. So these are explain, define, describe, compare, identify, summarise, calculate, illustrate and outline. And it's really important that learners understand what the meaning of each of these. So typical command verbs used to test knowledge tend to be define, describe, label, list and state. Whereas typical command verbs used to test understanding tend to ask for explanations. In other words, explain why, suggest reasons for, or identify. Whereas typical command verbs used to test the applied learning usually require candidates to discuss or explain a topic in some detail. So on this slide there's an infographic that you can use to get your learners used to the different command verbs and the types of answers typically required. So these can be used as prompts, and that gives an indication to learners of the type of response that is expected by the question. So moving on to the application of command verbs in questions, and to summarise this slide, we've listed the typical different expectation each type of command verb has. For example, in assessment objective 1, which is recall of knowledge, that uses command verbs such as state, list and identify type questions. And they typically require a separate point for each mark. Whereas assessment objective 2, which is understanding of concepts, theories and processes, are more of the intermediate mark question types, tend to use command verbs such as explain, describe and define type questions, and they may require a separate point or a limited explanation for 1 mark with a further mark available for a more in-depth explanation. Whereas assessment objective 4, which is the integrated application of knowledge and understanding type questions, are often longer and more marks are available, such as 6 to 12 marks, and they're longer type responses required, usually using the higher order command verbs such as discuss, evaluate and propose type questions, and they expect a higher quality or a more considered response to get those higher marks, and they're usually marked using that level of response marking. On this slide, I've included an activity for your learners to help them understand command verbs. Now this could be used for self-directed learning, where they can look up the meanings themselves, or you could ask for another word for each command verb to confirm their knowledge and understanding. The answers, as you see, are available in the link below. So following on from the previous slide, on this slide are the typical answers that you can use to give explanations of each of the meanings of the command verbs. The next few slides look at how this works in practice. There are examples of question types that carry lower marks and question types that attract higher marks and typical responses. So on this slide, you can see how the question and answers are structured for the 2-mark and 4-mark questions and answers. So for example, the command verb here is list. And list, the definition is give as many examples which the question requires. In this example, it's asking for 2. So it's saying list 2 responsibilities of an employer in your industry. So it's asking for 2 responses, and each one of those responses carries 1 mark each, totaling 2 marks for that question. Now, it's important to remember that there are more answers, correct answers to this than just those 2. There may be many more. Another one could be, for example, make reasonable adjustments for disabilities. Looking at the second type of question, which carries intermediate marks, which in other words, it's a 4-mark question. The command verb here is explain, and it's asking for 2 examples. So answer 1 is in 2 parts. So it's important to listen to what a customer is asking, is 1 mark. And the second part of the question, which is the explanation, why is that? To ensure you understand their request, which carries 2 marks for the first example. And the second is the customer is more than likely to return if you're able to communicate effectively, carries 1 mark. Again, explain why, as it enhances the customer experience, carrying 2 marks, which carries a 4 mark total. So again, there may be more answers which would be correct. In other words, you could use provide accurate information, gain positive reviews. So it's not just one typically correct mark, it's making sure that the learner understands the responses required for each command verb. So this slide looks at the types of questions that carry the larger marks. For example, the integrated questions, looking at the assessment objective 4, which is integration across the qualification. So in this example, the question is, a catering team has been asked to provide simple canapes for 50 people for the opening of a recording studio. Propose a suitable menu and discuss the wider factors to consider when planning and preparing for this event. So in this example, the question is a task-based scenario. So I've emboldened the key command verbs and their meanings. So propose, which is suggest, recommend and present an idea for a menu. Discuss, talk, write about a topic in detail and considering the different issues, ideas and opinions related to it. And wider factors means the bigger picture, things to think through and consider. Think carefully before making a decision. Now, it's worth encouraging your learners to always attempt this question, as there are a lot of marks to be gained. And a hint is to get your learners to highlight the key command verbs so they can keep referring to the task. Now, this carries 15 marks, which is the higher marks questions. So on this slide, you can see we provided an example of the type of content the learner needs to include to achieve those top marks of 11 to 15, which are in band 3 on the assessment guide. So you can see very clear the indicative content within the answer can include or should include the safe working practices, cooking methods and dietary requirements, use of small and large equipment, scale of production, sufficient stock timings, food safety, health and safety, correct use of equipment, staff levels and cost. And the content really is looking at the examiner will be looking at what justifies those higher marks. And this example below is giving you sort of the idea of what the examiner will be looking for, is that the menu is detailed, it's written clear, it's structured, there are options for special dietary requirements have been considered. The theme of the menu has been considered. Equipment and ingredients needed to produce the menu have been explained in detail. Health and safety has been considered and discussed. Again, the use of command verbs are coming within the answer here. Staffing, the bigger picture, staffing, planning and timings have also been considered. And to access these higher marks, the discussion will have to be comprehensive, well balanced and presented in a logical way with a conclusion or a recommendation. So these are really the stretch and challenge questions. On this slide, you can see an example of what reflects the response required in order to meet the minimum marks of 1 to 5 from band 1 for this question. So it's very different to the previous slide, whereas the lower marks, it's about writing a basic menu, providing an outline, identified some dietary considerations, demonstrated a basic understanding of health and safety with not a lot of detail, in other words with little detail, listed the equipment rather than considered. Some items may be missing, some basic personal hygiene was included with very little explanation or detail. So you can see the difference in both of those responses. So before writing out in full their answer to the extended questions, candidates may find it helpful to jot down a brief plan or an outline of how they're going to answer it. And this will help clarify their thinking and also to make sure they don't get too bogged down or provide too much detail for one part of the question at the expense of others. So it's important that learners try to give a considered response, bringing in different factors or things and considerations and can discuss the benefits and limitations of a particular proposal they are making, or make an effort to justify the suggestions that they make. Now, in these type of questions, there is often not simply one correct answer, but a multiple of different approaches that can be taken. And it may be helpful to consider responses to this type of question as a bit of a mini essay with a brief introduction, a main section, and a proposal or a discussion and a conclusion at the end that is linked to the scenario and the questions that are posed. One of the most important factors when preparing your learners for the theory exam is to make sure that they are familiar with the structure and layout of past papers, as learners tend to panic if something is unfamiliar to them. So you could use the past sample papers and answer guides for the technical qualification. Remember that the papers are all set out in a similar way, and if the written papers, the space below tends to give an indication of the length of the response required. Now, most learners tend not to read the questions properly, so a hint and tip is at the end of a lesson, make up a question from the content taught that day and structure that question the same way as on the exam paper, and maybe split the question into 1 or 2 or even 3 parts. It's really important to provide printouts either in the form of exercise books, fact sheets or revision guides for each of the units taught. And hints and tips again, you know which units most of the exam questions are going to be focused on, so also make sure your learners are aware of this. Now, feedback that we've had from chief examiners always mention the fact that most learners lose marks because they haven't read the questions properly. So one suggestion could be, during your practice tests, encourage the learners to read through the full paper or the online test. Now, in the exam guides, we produce the hints and tips sector that have some great ideas that can and should be implemented, such as not always starting at question 1. You can allow your learner to build confidence in answering the questions that they feel confident about. Look at the marks across the papers. Learners often miss out on marks due to the fact they concentrate on the higher mark questions and ignore the lower mark questions, or vice versa. Constantly provide revision guides and sheets for your learners, as you know again that which units the exam will focus on. This is just an idea that you can use for your weekly knowledge checks, so learners can create their own revision guides from the weekly tests, and you can just have a formative assessment at the end of the lesson just to consolidate knowledge and understanding. It's important to keep the language simple, as many learners may not understand what a synoptic assignment is, but they will have heard the words project or controlled assessment. So when they're completing their synoptic assessments, it may be helpful to use language that they are most used to. It's also useful to explain to learners what type of qualification they are studying. Some learners may not be expecting a test or exam. A useful analogy to use is to think of the qualification handbook as a book that's just divided into chapters. The learners will have to know what's in the whole book, but will only be tested on certain chapters or units. It's also important that we understand many learners will have taken exams at some point, and in many cases it is just a case of just relearning those revision skills. It's also important to provide revision fact sheets at the end of every lesson and ask the learners to tell you what they've learned today and write it down. You may find using techniques such as the round robin strategy useful. This is where students are situated around a table in a discussion. Students then generate ideas on a specific topic or question. However, with this strategy, there is equal participation among students as well as multiple discussions that can take place. I've included a link which provides more detail. Learners should also be encouraged to create a dictionary of new technical words throughout their learning. Always use correct names in a practicals lesson to embed the terminology through practice, and therefore helping the learners to visualize the correct terminology. This helps to expand their vocabulary while studying their technical qualification. Another useful hint is to encourage your learners to highlight keywords and maybe introduce mnemonics for qualifications that have processes. And finally, ongoing formative assessment is key to establishing how your learners are progressing. It's so important to test and check and test and check again. How to test your learners. There are some suggestions and links here to websites to help with using teaching and learning strategies which encourage your candidates or learners to be curious and creative and develop their confidence and increasing independence. Some learners tend to use flashcards for each learning outcome. Many prefer to write in exercise books. They will access YouTube for some useful online resources or sharing resources online internally, and some may prefer to use textbooks. But this slide provides a wide range of resources that you can access. So to summarise, candidates with a good understanding of the subject being assessed can often lose marks in exams because they lack experience or confidence in exams or awareness of how to maximise the time that's available to get the most out of the exam. So here are some suggested guidance for areas that could be covered in advance to help learners improve their exam performance. So before the exam, although candidates cannot plan the answers they were given in advance, exams for technical qualifications do follow a common structure and format. So in advance of taking the exam, candidates should be familiar with the structure of the exam, for example, the number and type of questions they can expect, be aware of the amount of time they have in total to complete the exam. They should have a plan based on the exam start and finish time for how long to spend on each question or section of the exam. They should be aware of how many marks are available for each question, how much they should expect to write for each question, and allow most time for those questions which have the most marks available. A paper-based exam can look and feel very different to exams that are taken online. The majority of technical awards are available in both paper-based and online, so you have a choice of which type of exam will suit your learners. So at the start of the exam, candidates should carefully read through the instructions before answering any questions. They may find it helpful, where possible, to mark or highlight key information, such as command verbs and the number of marks available on the question paper. They should be able to identify questions which require an extended written answer, and those questions where all or part of the question may be answered by giving bullets or lists, etc., rather than full sentences. So answering the questions. Candidates do not have to answer exam questions in any particular order. They may find it helpful to consider, for example, tackling first those questions which they find easiest. This should help get them into the flow of the exam and help confidence by building up marks quickly and at the start of the exam. Tackling the extended answer question at an early stage of the exam to make sure that they spend sufficient time on it and do not run out of time at the end of the exam. Candidates, however, should avoid wasting time by repeating the question either in full or in part of their answer. So candidates should always attempt every question, even those questions where they may be less confident about the answer they're giving. They should be discouraged, however, from spending too long on any answer they are less sure about, and provide answers that are longer and give more detail than should be necessary in the hope that they may pick up marks. This may mean they have less time to answer questions that they are better prepared to answer. So towards the end of the exam, candidates should always set aside time at the end of the exam to read back through and review what they have written in order to make this legible, to make sure this is legible. It makes sense and answers those questions in full. Now, many learners do not fully answer the question and can lose marks if they've only answered part of a question. So it's important that the learner needs to know and ask themselves, have I answered the full question? So if a candidate finds they're running out of time to finish an answer towards the end of the exam, they should attempt to complete the answer in an abbreviated or a note form. Now, provided the content is clear and relevant, examiners will consider such answers and award marks where merited. However, this may not attract as higher marks as a structured and considered response would attract. So thank you. This concludes the hints and tips for the theory exam presentation.